On a night blanketed in snow, a man lies trapped beneath burning beams as his cabin collapses when a black dog charges through the flames, dragging him back from the edge of death. No one knows where it came from. No one knows what it's endured. But from that moment on, their lives are bound by a journey through darkness, heartbreak, and hope. Subscribe now to catch every emotional and gripping story we bring to life. It was the kind of cold that carved itself into bones. The kind of cold that silenced everything. No birds, no rustling trees, no signs of life beyond the occasional plume of steam rising from a distant chimney. Snow blanketed the mountain ridge like a breath held too long, the white dense and endless. And tucked between two jagged arms of the valley, hidden beneath a canopy of frost-stiffened pines, sat a cabin. Weathered, quiet, alone. Inside, Jack Whitmore moved like a man whose body remembered fire. Every movement was deliberate: shoulders, squared boots placed firmly, breath measured as if he were still listening for cracks in the floorboards or the whine of a distant siren. He stood at the kitchen counter pouring a mug of coffee, his fingers lingering around the chipped rim. There were 2 mugs on the shelf. One hadn't been used in years. The radio buzzed static and low country music, a song Sarah used to hum when they cleaned the garage. Jack didn't change the station. He rarely did. The silence in the house wasn't oppressive, just constant. Like wallpaper he could no longer see, but still knew was there. He lit the wood stove, its orange glow fighting back the cold in waves, not unlike the way memory fights the forgetting. On the mantel above the fire sat a photograph. Faded, but tender. Jack, a younger version, arms wrapped around a woman whose laugh you could almost hear from the image. Sarah. Her eyes bright, her smile full. She wore a firehouse cap too large for her head. He never moved that picture, even after everything. There had been a fire. 2 years ago. A building collapsed during a call he should have been on, but wasn't because it was their anniversary. Sarah had gone in his place. That choice had cost him everything. He had replayed the call over 1,000 times in his head. Had it been her voice that last came over the radio? The muffled shout, the sound of wood giving way? He would never know. The report said she died instantly, but reports were written by people who weren't there. Jack had stopped trusting reports. He had moved here 6 months after. Left the city, the job, the noise. Friends had called it healing. Jack just called it breathing without alarms. That morning had been uneventful. Wood chopping, snow shoveling, checking the propane. A life measured by survival rather than joy. Jack didn't complain. He didn't speak to anyone unless he needed supplies. His world was quiet, controlled, contained. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the temperature dropped with a snap. Frost crept across the windows like spiderwebs. Jack pulled on his flannel, added more wood to the fire, and grabbed a flashlight before heading outside to check the perimeter. Snow crunched beneath his boots, the sound sharp against the vast stillness. And that's when he saw it. At the far end of this porch, huddled beneath the overhang, was a dark shape. Not moving, not barking. Just a curled mass pressed tight against the wall like it was trying to disappear into the grain of the wood. Instinct kicked in. Years of calls of emergencies, of training. Jack crouched low, approached slow. No sudden moves. The flashlight beam caught 2 glints of amber. Eyes, wide, watching, waiting. It was a dog. Barely. Skinny as bone ribs, casting long shadows across a matted coat that might have once been glossy black. Snow clung to its fur ice at its paws. It didn't lift its head. Didn't growl. Just trembled. Silent. "Hey there." Jack's voice was low even. "You lost Buddy?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but its ears flicked. That was something. Jack scanned the woods beyond. No footprints leading in, no tracks except his own. This animal hadn't wandered here. It had been left. He looked back down. The dog still hadn't moved. It looked more like a shadow than a living thing, an outline of suffering etched in darkness. He rose and went inside, returned with an old fleece blanket and a bowl of warm broth. Set them down carefully a few feet away. Then he backed off. Watched. Nothing. The dog just stared, eyes unblinking, not dead. But something in it already had been. Jack stood there longer than he meant to. Something about those eyes. He'd seen that kind of look before, after fires. Survivors pulled from rubble. Kids in corners. People whose brains hadn't yet caught up to the fact that they'd lived through something that should have ended them. He knew what that look meant. It said, "Don't touch me. Don't lie to me. Don't make me hope." So he didn't. He left the door cracked and returned inside. Hours passed. Snow fell heavier. Jack sat by the fire pretending to read. But every so often his eyes drifted to the door, to the silence beyond it. Just after midnight, the bowl was empty. The blanket had been moved. By morning, the dog was still there. Not at the edge of the porch this time, but closer, curled beside the threshold like it had always belonged. Jack opened the door slowly. "Still here, huh?" The dog blinked. No tail wag, no sound. But it didn't flinch. Jack held the door wide. "I won't force you," and turned away. The dog stood, walked in. No hesitation, no fear. Just steps made from exhaustion. It padded to the fire and collapsed with a sigh so deep Jack felt it in his chest. He didn't touch it, not yet. That night, he filled the second bowl of food. Set it near the first. Filled a small tub with warm water. The dog didn't move. It wasn't until Jack sat on the far couch, pretending to watch a show he'd seen a dozen times, that he noticed movement. The dog lifted its head, watched him. "Not much of a talker, huh?" he said softly. The dog blinked once, then rested its head again. Days passed. The dog never barked, never made a sound. But it followed Jack from room to room, never close, always a few feet behind. Like a shadow. That's what he started calling it. Not out loud at first, just in his head. Shadow. It fit. When he fed it, he'd say the name, just once. Eat up, Shadow. When he came in from outside, evening, Shadow. And every night, as the fire dimmed, good night, Shadow. The dog never responded. But it listened. Jack didn't try to leash it, didn't wash it, didn't expect anything from it. He just let it exist, let it be there, let it stay. And that was the beginning. Shadow never barked, never growled, never even whimpered. He simply existed, quiet, precise, deliberate. Wherever Jack went, the dog followed. Not close enough to touch, but always there, trailing him like an echo in the snow. At first, Jack didn't notice. Too used to his own company, too accustomed to silence being the only sound that didn't need answering. But it was hard to miss the subtle weight of presence when it shifted behind you. Soft paws landing without a sound, the rustle of fur when the wind blew hard, the slow, steady inhale of something alive, sharing your space. In the mornings, Jack would make coffee and lean against the sink. Behind him, Shadow would lie exactly 4 feet away, unmoving, unblinking. When Jack headed outside to chop wood, the dog would sit by the door until Jack returned, then resume his silent patrol. If Jack stepped into the garage, Shadow followed. If he sat on the porch, Shadow settled beside the railing. Not beside him, never that close, but near enough to watch. Always near enough to watch. Jack didn't speak much at first. The habit had been beaten out of him by months of solitude. But habits crack when you're no longer truly alone. "Not much of a conversationalist, are you?" he muttered one evening, tossing a chunk of wood into the fire. The flames flared. The moment they did, Shadow flinched hard. His whole body seized like someone had yanked a cord inside him. Jack froze. Hey, easy." Shadow had retreated to the far corner of the room, tail low, eyes wide. His ears pinned back so far they all but disappeared. He didn't run, didn't snarl, just trembled, violently. Jack set the fire poker down, sat cross-legged on the floor, and waited. "You afraid of fire?" he asked softly. "That why you froze out there that night?" Shadow didn't move. Jack kept his voice low. "I know that fear. It's different for me, I guess. Mine's wrapped in the smell of burning plastic and sirens and screams." He let out a shaky breath. "But fear is fear, huh?" Shadow blinked once, then looked away. Later that night, Jack knelt behind the dog with a flashlight. Gently, patiently, he brushed away the matted fur along the spine. That's when he saw it. Scar tissue, thick, rope-like. A twisted path of damaged skin that ran across the shoulder blades and down to the rib cage. He didn't need to be a vet to understand what he was seeing. Years in rescue taught him how to read a burn. But this wasn't from fire. This was from a chain. Tight, embedded. The kind that digs into flesh when left too long. The kind that doesn't just bind it, punishes. Jack swallowed hard. Shadow didn't growl. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, letting it happen, eyes staring into a space far beyond the walls. "You've been through hell," Jack whispered. Shadow sat, quiet, still. Over the next few days, the routine deepened. Jack no longer ignored the presence. He expected it, welcomed it. Found himself speaking into the quiet as if it would break apart otherwise. "You ever seen a sunrise, Shadow?" he'd ask while splitting wood eyes on the pink edge of the sky. Sarah loved this time of year, he'd mutter over his shoulder while making stew. Said snow made everything honest. The dog never answered. But he never left either. At night, Jack would sometimes dream of fire. He'd wake with sweat down his spine, breath caught in his throat. And Shadow would be there silent and still by the fireplace, watching. Always watching. One afternoon, Jack turned on the radio while fixing a broken chair leg. Static crackled. Then music. Old blues. Shadow lifted his head slightly. The faintest reaction. A memory sparked behind those amber eyes. "You know this one?" Jack asked, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Shadow lay his head back down, but this time closer. 2 feet away. Closer than before. "You got a story, don't you?" Jack said. "Something ugly back there. But you're still here. Still whole, even if broken." Jack didn't know what made him keep talking. Maybe it was the echo of his own voice against the cabin walls. Maybe it was the weight of unspoken grief still sitting in his throat. Or maybe it was because Shadow listened better than any human ever had. Later that week, Jack posted a photo on a missing pet forum, a blurry image of Shadow lying near the wood stove. Caption found near Hollow Ridge. No collar, no chip. Quiet, won't leave. He didn't expect much. He certainly didn't expect the dozens of replies. None of them matched. One woman thought it was her dog lost in Colorado 2 years ago. Another sent a picture of a similar dog stolen from her backyard in Texas. A rescuer from Montana claimed Shadow looked identical to a retired K9 she'd placed in a foster home until he ran away after a car backfired and spooked him. Jack scrolled through all of them, heart sinking with each mismatch. No chip, no collar, no way to trace where Shadow had come from or who had hurt him. The only truth was in the dog's silence and the twitch of his shoulders whenever Jack threw kindling into the fire. Whatever life Shadow had known before had ended in fear. And whatever he was now, he was rebuilding it in silence. Jack didn't press. He just stopped asking. One morning, the snow was thicker than usual. Jack opened the cabin door and grumbled at the drift piled across the porch. Well, he muttered, "Guess it's us against the mountain today." He turned and stopped. Shadow stood in the hallway. For the first time since arriving, the dog made eye contact. Sustained. Solid. Then, without prompting, he padded over and sat beside the door. Jack blinked. "You want to come?" Shadow didn't move. Jack reached for his boots. "Suit yourself." 5 minutes later, he opened the door. Cold slapped him in the face. Wind howled. Behind him, footsteps. Shadow stepped out into the snow. Together, they trudged through the drifts toward the woodshed. Jack handed the axe swung. Wood cracked open. Shadow sat and watched. When Jack stopped to wipe sweat from his brow, Shadow stood and sniffed the air, then sat again, calm, patient, present. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something else, shared air, shared pain, shared survival. That night, Jack poured a second bowl of food. No hesitation. Shadow ate. Later, as the fire burned low, Jack sank into his worn armchair and looked at the shape curled near the hearth. "You ever think about staying?" he asked. Shadow blinked once, didn't move. "Not saying it'd be easy. I'm not exactly warm company. I talk to ghosts. And I drink too much coffee." No reaction. "But you're here. And I'm here. And maybe that's enough." The logs shifted. Embers sparked. Shadow didn't flinch this time. His eyes stayed steady on the flame. Jack leaned back, let his gaze drift to the ceiling. "Sarah would have liked you," he said softly. "She always did like strays." Shadow stood stretched, then moved closer. He lay at Jack's feet. For the first time, Jack didn't move. Didn't speak. Just let it happen. The connection wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was a breath drawn in silence. A weight shared between souls. A scar acknowledged. That night, Jack didn't dream of fire, and Shadow didn't sleep at the hearth. He slept beside the chair, one paw resting lightly over Jack's boot. The storm rolled in quiet, like something old and angry crawling over the ridge. Jack noticed it around sundown, low clouds thick like bruises, and a strange stillness in the air, the kind that hums just beneath your skin. The fire in the stove crackled behind him, but even that sounded hesitant. Outside, the wind stalled. Shadow sat by the door, ears erect, tail still, watching. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, looked out the window, and muttered, "That sky's not done with us." Lightning blinked once, distant too far to feel. Then silence again. Jack checked the backup generator, secured the tool shed, double-bolted the windows. He'd lived through enough wild nights to know better than to trust a calm that came too quickly. The air had changed. He felt it in his bones the way old firefighters do, the way trauma trains you to listen when the world goes quiet. Back inside, Shadow hadn't moved. He was still staring at the trees. "You feel it too, huh?" Jack asked. Shadow's tail gave a twitch. No more. The first crack of thunder didn't come until 2 hours later. By then the wind was howling, and the trees had begun their ancient groaning dance. Jack sat in the armchair, boots on flashlight within reach. He wasn't planning to sleep. Shadow paced, not frantic but alert. His eyes kept flicking to the windows. Jack noticed it, then the flicker of something deep and buried rising in the dog's chest like smoke. Not panic, but memory. Shadow had known storms like this, somewhere, sometime, and it had left its mark. Then came the strike. A bolt of white split the tree line behind the cabin, searing the sky with a sound like the world being torn in half. Jack saw it hit, saw the light ignite a pine's crown, felt the cabin shake with the force of it. A half-second later, the lights died. The room went black. Jack was already moving, flashlight in hand, swinging toward the back window. "Shit," he whispered. Through the swirling snow and the blind flashes of lightning, he saw the fire bloom. It started high in the trees, licking through the branches like a starving animal. The wind fed it fast. Too fast. The fire jumped tree to tree like it had purpose. He turned to Shadow. "We gotta go." But even as he said it, a second smaller strike hit something closer. Sparks rained against the side of the cabin. Then came the smell, burning insulation. Something electrical had caught inside. Then the unmistakable sound of wood groaning. The cabin, their only shelter, was catching fire from within. Jack ran to the hallway, heading for the breaker box. A pop, sharp and loud, echoed behind him. Then smoke. Thick, acrid. The world narrowed instantly. Visibility vanished. He reached for the fire extinguisher. Another pop, this one lower. Something structural. The floor shifted. The roof groaned. And then it happened, the beam. It came down with a sickening crack, splintering through the ceiling and pinning Jack beneath it before he could shout. His body folded under the weight, pain shooting through his ribs, his shoulder screaming. He gasped. Tried to move. Couldn't. Smoke poured in like water. The fire had taken hold. "Shadow," he coughed. "Shadow." But there was no answer. Just the roar of the blaze and the creak of collapsing wood. His eyes stung. His lungs clawed for air. Panic fought its way in. So this was it. Not fire in a city apartment. Not on duty. But here, quietly, stupidly, alone. Jack blinked against the smoke, thinking of Sarah, of the warmth of her laugh, the way she always left notes on the bathroom mirror. And then something moved, not through the door, through the smoke, a shape low, fast, dark. Shadow. The dog burst into view through the haze, Hackle's raised eyes wild with something between terror and defiance. He paused at the sight of Jack, frozen only for a second. "Get out," Jack choked. "Go!" But Shadow didn't run. He moved toward Jack. Step by step, through the heat, ignoring the flames, eating their way along the rafters. His body was low, ears pinned, but his gaze was locked. The fire popped again, louder this time. A second beam split from the ceiling, landing inches behind Shadow. The dog flinched, but didn't stop. Jack tried to lift himself. Couldn't. Blood warmed his side where a shard had cut deep. Shadow reached him. The dog pressed his head against the beam. Pushed. Whined low in his throat. Tried again. "No, stop," Jack hissed. "Go." But Shadow didn't listen. He grabbed the thick denim of Jack's jacket sleeve with his teeth. Braced. Pulled. Nothing. Again. Harder. The wood shifted. Not much. Just enough for Jack to drag one arm free. Shadow lunged, teeth working their way to Jack's shoulder. He pulled with everything he had, legs scrambling for traction on the scorched floor. The air was unbearable now, like breathing through molten glass. Then a shift. The beam gave an inch. Then another. Jack felt his ribs shift as he rolled. Shadow pulled again. And then they were moving. Together. Out the hall. Through the smoke. Around the sagging frame of the front door, half burnt. Shadow slammed into it. Nothing. Backed up. Rammed it again. Crack. Again. And again. Finally the wood split. The door gave way. Cold air hit them like a slap. Jack gasped, the oxygen burning through his chest like a knife. Shadow dragged him into the snow, away from the flame, past the porch into the clearing. Then stopped. Jack lay there, coughing, weeping, his body aching in every corner. Above them, the cabin burned a pyre, lighting up the mountain. Shadow stood over him, chest heaving, black fur backlit in firelight. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. With purpose. And Jack saw something in that gaze. Something ancient and unbreakable. Not instinct. Not training. Choice. Shadow had chosen to go back. To face the fire. To face the very thing he had been scarred by, shattered by. To save someone he didn't have to. Jack reached up. His fingers brushed the dog's chest. "You damn fool." He coughed. Shadow sat beside him. Didn't move. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. A neighbor must have seen the blaze. By the time the fire crew arrived, there was nothing left to save of the cabin. But they found Jack wrapped in a wool blanket, a broken arm cradled against his side, eyes glassy. And beside him, unmoving but alert, was the dog. No collar, no chip, no ID, just loyalty. When the news broke the next day, it wasn't the fire that made headlines. It was the dog, Photos snapped by first responders showed Shadow sitting over Jack's unconscious body, the flames behind them like a wall of judgment. The caption read, "Unknown dog saves firefighter from blaze." The photo went viral within hours. People didn't care where the dog came from. They just saw the look in his eyes. And they knew this wasn't a pet. This was something more, something sacred, something that had walked through fire and carried someone else out. The fire was gone, reduced to blackened timber, curling smoke, and a crater of ash where Jack's cabin had once stood. The mountains were quiet again, deceptively so, like nothing had happened. Like the trees hadn't watched it all unfold. Only the scent lingered, scorched earth and wet soot. And something else, grief maybe, or survival. Jack sat on the back bumper of a fire truck, ribs wrapped, shoulder braced. His skin was raw, smoke-burned eyes, bloodshot. But he was alive. Because of the dog, Shadow lay a few feet away, tethered loosely to the side mirror by a thin leash someone had handed Jack. It wasn't necessary. Shadow hadn't moved once. He just watched. One of the paramedics took a photo half out of awe, half disbelief. The man whispered, "This dog dragged you out." Jack nodded. "What's his name?" Jack's voice came rough, low, Shadow. That photo, shadow black against snow and fire, was uploaded within the hour. No hashtags, no explanation. Just a single caption: "He walked through fire to bring a man out." The world saw it. It spread faster than the flames had. By nightfall, news anchors were calling him the ghost dog of Hollow Ridge. Radio stations played updates between traffic reports. Animal rights groups shared theories. Rescue pages lit up with speculation. Is he trained? Was he a military dog? Does he belong to someone? Jack turned his phone off. He didn't want the noise, but the world had already seen the eyes of a dog that chose to go into a burning building, and now it wanted answers. 3 days later, Jack stood in the snow beside what used to be his cabin, a mug of gas station coffee in hand, Shadow sitting beside him. The new silence between them was different now, heavier, tinged with the weight of what had happened. Shadow didn't just follow anymore. He stayed close. Close enough that Jack felt the warmth of him through his coat. "I don't know what to call you," Jack said. A miracle, a ghost, a second chance. The dog didn't answer, but when Jack turned, Shadow looked up and held his gaze. The next morning, Jack got a call from someone claiming to be from a local shelter. They had been flooded with emails. One in particular stood out. "Her name's Eliza. Says she knows the dog. Sent photos, stories. Wants to talk to you directly." Jack hesitated. "What makes you think she's legit?" "She didn't ask for the dog back," the woman said. "Just to see him." That afternoon, Jack sat outside the temporary shelter someone in town had lent him. A heater buzzed inside. Shadow lay curled on a blanket head on his paws. Jack scrolled through his inbox. Found the email. Subject bear. He clicked. There were pictures first. Grainy. A woman with auburn hair holding a black lab mix in her lap. The dog was smaller, younger, but the eyes were the same. One image showed the dog lying on a hospital bed, muzzle resting gently on the arm of a sleeping patient. Another showed him sitting beside a crib, alert, protective. Then the words, "His name was Bear. I rescued him when I was 26 after I lost my son. He was trained as a therapy dog. He slept by my side through the worst months of my life. He's the reason I'm still breathing." Jack stared at the words for a long time. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then he typed, "Come." 2 days later, a blue Honda pulled up the snowy path. Jack waited on the porch, arms crossed, tight, Shadow at his feet. The woman who stepped out was taller than he expected. Pale, worn down in the eyes, but there was a steadiness in her step. She carried no leash, no treats, just her breath visible in the mountain air. Jack didn't speak. She knelt. Shadow watched. "Eliza," Jack said. She nodded. "And that's him." "You're sure?" "Yes." Jack glanced down at Shadow. The dog hadn't moved. Eliza reached into her coat and pulled out something small, a frayed rope toy. Faded red, the kind sold in dollar bins. She held it in her palm and whispered, "Bear." Shadow looked. His eyes flicked to the toy, then to her. His ears twitched, but he didn't get up. Eliza's face broke. Not into a smile, but something sadder. Recognition and heartbreak combined. "It's him," she said softly. "But he's different now." Jack watched the interaction carefully. There was no tail wag, no jump of joy. But there wasn't fear either. Just stillness, a kind of guarded acknowledgement. Eliza sat on the porch steps, setting the toy between them. "I was with someone years ago," she began. "Someone who didn't like dogs. Or me, really. But Bear, he always got in the way. Kept standing between us when things got violent." Jack didn't interrupt. "I had a miscarriage. He hit me that night. Bear stood over me and wouldn't move. Just stood there growling. I thought he'd kill Bear. I waited until he passed out and ran. Took Bear with me. Jack's jaw tensed. We lived in my car for a while. One night I left the window cracked and Bear was just gone. I looked everywhere, put up flyers, called every rescue. Nothing. I thought maybe he found someone better. Shadow shifted slightly, leaned into Jack's leg. Jack felt it barely just pressure. Eliza's eyes welled. I'm not here to take him. I just needed to see, to know he was okay. Jack knelt beside Shadow, rested a hand on his back. He saved my life, Jack said. He walked through fire to get to me. He always ran toward pain, she whispered, even when it wasn't his. They sat in silence. After a few minutes, Eliza stood, wiped her hands on her jeans. Jack rose. You sure you don't want? No, she said quickly. He's not mine anymore. Maybe he never really was. Dogs like him, they belong to something bigger. She turned to leave, then paused. Call him whatever name he answers to. But I'll always remember him as Bear. The dog who kept me alive when I didn't want to be. She walked back to her car, drove away. Jack watched until the dust disappeared. When he turned, Shadow was staring up at him. You knew her, Jack murmured. Didn't you? The dog didn't blink. Jack sat beside him, staring at the horizon, voice low. So what are you, Shadow, a ghost from a past life? An angel in fur? Shadow laid his head on Jack's knee, and for the first time, Jack didn't feel like the one rescuing the dog. He felt rescued. The snow was falling again, thicker now, heavier. It covered the wreckage of Jack's old cabin like nature was trying to erase it like a burial. But some things don't get buried. Not really. They resurface when least expected, dragging the past behind them like chains. The temporary cabin Jack was staying in was smaller, colder. Borrowed. He didn't complain. Shadow slept on a folded blanket beside the stove, his eyes following Jack wherever he moved. They didn't speak. Not in words. But something passed between them now, a rhythm. Shared silence. Breath to breath. Then came the knock. 3 quick raps against the cabin door. Jack, sharpening an axe by the window, froze. Visitors were rare out here. Unannounced ones, almost non-existent. He opened the door. A man stood in the snow boots caked with ice coat, lined in military green. He wasn't young, but still held the posture of someone who had spent his life following orders. Broad shoulders, sharp jaw, an eye that flicked over Jack like he was cataloging threat levels. Jack Whitmore. That's me. The man held out a laminated photo. I think that's your dog. Jack took it, looked. The image was grainy, but clear enough, a black dog lean and alert standing beside a group of soldiers in desert gear. On the vest, strapped across his chest in yellow block letters, XR16. Jack's stomach dropped. The man stepped forward. Name's Travis Keller. I was his handler. That dog saved my life more than once. Inside, Shadow stirred. Jack's voice came slow, cautious. What makes you think they're the same? Same build, same eyes, same scar above the back left leg that's from shrapnel in Fallujah. Travis squinted. And I saw the video, the fire rescue. That's XR16. I'd bet my life on it. Jack turned the photo over. On the back, a date from 6 years ago. A name, Reaper. He went by Reaper, Jack asked, brow furrowed. Travis nodded. Nickname from the unit. His real designation was XR16, explosives detection. I worked with him 2 tours. Then during a convoy op outside Kandahar, something went wrong. He ran ahead like always doing his job. Flagged something. But before I could follow the road, lit up. I blacked out. What happened to him? Gone, Travis said. His voice thinned. No trace. Base thought he was dead. Or stolen. I didn't believe it. Jack stepped aside. Come in. Travis entered. The warmth hit him immediately. But it wasn't the fire that made him pause. It was Shadow. The dog had risen, stood stiffly near the stove, eyes locked on the man. Not growling, not afraid, just watching. Travis crouched. Reaper, he said quietly. Shadow didn't move. Reaper come. Still nothing. Travis reached into his coat, pulled out something small, an old patch, faded, frayed. He set it on the ground. Shadow blinked. Jack saw the change, a subtle drop in the shoulders, a twitch in the tail. A flicker of recognition passed through the dog's frame like a ghost stepping through him. Travis smiled. He remembers. Jack sat in the chair opposite, hands folded tight. If he's yours, why didn't you come looking before now? I did. I filed a report. Asked the VA, the Army. Nobody had answers. He looked at the dog with something bordering reverence. Then I saw the news last week. The fire. That photo. I knew it had to be him. Shadow stepped forward, slowly, sniffed the patch, then looked at Jack. Not for permission, for confirmation. Jack said nothing. Travis continued softer now. We bonded on patrol. He learned fast. Didn't bark much. Smart dogs don't. They know silence saves lives. He found 2 mines before they found us. There's a wall of names that can't brag. I owe mine to him. The words hung in the air like dust. Jack cleared his throat. He's been through a lot since then. I can see that Travis set eyes on the scar above Shadow's flank. What happened after Kandahar? Travis exhaled. I woke up 2 weeks later in Germany. No word, no records. I assumed he didn't make it. But part of me never stopped looking. Jack studied the man. So, what now? You want to take him back? The question cut clean through the room. Shadow turned his head, looked between them. Travis hesitated. He's not the same dog I lost. You're not the same man who found him. Jack said nothing. Travis finally sighed. I didn't come to rip him away. I just wanted to know. Needed to see him one more time. He stood. Jack did too. He's been more than just a dog to me, Jack admitted. He pulled me out of something I didn't think I could come back from. I get it, Travis said, extending his hand. Jack shook it, but long after Travis left, after the sound of the truck faded into the trees, Jack remained standing in that quiet space. Shadow had returned to his place by the stove. He was curled tightly now, eyes half-lidded, tired from the encounter. But Jack felt the weight of it pressing on him. Therapy dog, rescue dog, war dog. He wasn't just Shadow. He had been Bear, Reaper, XR16. He had carried burdens from lives before Jack's. Jack whispered into the dark, more to himself than anything. Who are you really? Shadow stirred, but didn't answer. Later that night, Jack sat by the fire photo in hand. The young soldiers' arms around each other, dust covering their uniforms, and there he was, front and center, a black shadow in the desert sun eyes, sharp tail still. Jack felt suddenly small, insufficient, like someone who had stumbled into something sacred. I don't know if I'm enough for you, he murmured. Shadow raised his head. Jack leaned forward. You've saved soldiers, saved women, saved me, and I'm just some broken man in the woods. Shadow got up, walked to Jack's chair, rested his head in Jack's lap. Jack closed his eyes, and this time he didn't say anything more. It was supposed to be a routine checkup. Jack hadn't planned on it, not until Shadow limped slightly after getting up from his spot by the stove 2 nights in a row. It wasn't much, barely noticeable, but Jack saw it. The kind of limp a soldier recognized. The kind that says pain's been sitting in the joints for too long, waiting for permission to speak. So that morning, Jack bundled Shadow into the passenger seat of his old Ford, a blanket under him and a thermos of coffee between them. The local vet was 20 miles out, nestled in the town's only brick building that didn't lean slightly in the snow. You're not going to like this, Jack murmured as he drove. But I figured you earned a proper look over. Shadow didn't respond. He never did on the road. He simply stared ahead, eyes on the horizon like he was watching for something only he could see. They pulled into the lot just after 10. The air was brisk, sky clear, a rare gift of sunlight spreading across the windshield. Jack parked close to the entrance engine still running. He reached over, scratched behind Shadow's ears. I'll check you in. Be back in 2. Shadow licked his hand once, slow, deliberate. Jack smiled. He left the door unlocked. That decision would haunt him. Inside the clinic smelled like antiseptic and dog treats. A golden retriever puppy yipped from behind the reception counter. Jack gave the name. Shadow Whitmore filled out a clipboard and set it down. 3 minutes. That's all it took. He stepped back outside into the light, and the seat was empty. His gut dropped before his mind even caught up. The passenger door hung open, swaying in the wind. No barking. No struggle. Just absence. No, Jack whispered, sprinting to the truck. Shadow was gone. Panic hit like a punch. Jack's eyes scanned the lot. Nothing. No sign of movement. No tracks in the snow beyond what he'd left. He ran back inside, voice hoarse. Call the police. Someone took my dog. The receptionist stood up, startled. What? Call them now. 15 minutes later, a deputy arrived. Young, polite. Too calm for what Jack was feeling. They reviewed the parking lot footage together in the back room. The video was grainy black and white, time-stamped. It showed Jack walking inside. 30 seconds later, a dark-colored pickup truck, make unclear, pulled in from the far end. The driver wore a hoodie and gloves. The passenger door opened. A masked figure stepped out. No hesitation, no chaos. They moved like they knew what they were doing. Shadow sat still until the figure approached the truck. Then barely a reaction. A small rise, a shift. Then he was yanked from the seat. Carried. Lifted like cargo. The truck drove off in under 30 seconds. Jack stared at the screen, fists clenched. Can we enhance that plate, he asked. The deputy shook his head. Too blurry. Jack didn't speak. His jaw locked, eyes burning. Not again. Not again. He walked outside. The sky had turned gray clouds, sliding in like closing fists. He leaned on the hood of his truck and pressed both hands flat against the metal like it might hold him up when his knees refused to. Shadow was gone. Not run away, not lost. Stolen. And that made it worse. Infinitely worse. Because someone had known where to find him. Jack barely slept that night. He sat at the table phone buzzing every 10 minutes as he posted to every rescue group, every lost pet page, every vet forum. He uploaded photos, offered a reward, gave a burner number. Nothing yet. But someone knew, and Jack would find them. By morning, he'd already rewatched the security footage 12 times. Each time, he slowed the frames, studied the posture, the way the figure approached, no pause, no hesitation. Whoever took Shadow knew him, knew his patterns, knew his silence. Jack called Travis. "You think someone's trying to reclaim him?" he asked. There was a pause on the line. "You mean like a black market handler?" "Yes," Travis exhaled. "It's possible. Dogs like XR16, they're valuable, not just emotionally, financially. Military dogs get resold, reprogrammed, sometimes worse." Jack clenched the phone. "What do I do?" "Don't wait. Start looking." "I already am." "Then go faster." Jack didn't eat for the next 36 hours. He printed flyers, drove to gas stations, left notes on truck windshields. He started asking the town's mechanics if they'd seen a black pickup come in for repairs. Most hadn't. One did. 2 days ago, the man said. Came in for a busted rear taillight. Had a dent on the driver's side door. "Did you get a name?" "Paid cash. Security cameras. Broke last week." Jack's face was stone. He went to the county shelters. Then 3 more in neighboring towns. Everywhere he left the same message: black dog. Silent. Scarred. If he looks at you like he knows everything, you found him. On the 4th day, Jack returned to the empty cabin site. He stood in the middle of the ruins, wind biting through his jacket. "I'm not letting them keep you," he whispered. "You hear me?" But there was no response. Just wind, just snow. But beneath it all, something stirred in Jack, something he hadn't felt in years. Not since Sarah died. The need to fight, to chase, to hunt. He reached into his pocket, pulled out Shadow's worn collar, closed it tight in his fist. The world had taken everything from him before. Not this time. The lead came from a gas station mechanic. He hadn't wanted to talk at first, just muttered about keeping to his own lane while wiping his hands on a rag already soaked with grease. But when Jack pulled out the photo of Shadow Eyes, fierce fur singed from fire, the man paused, then nodded once. Guy who drives that black pickup doesn't come in often. But when he does, it's always late. Nights. Doesn't talk. Always smells like bleach and wet dog. Jack's pulse quickened. "Where's he go?" The mechanic hesitated. "Somewhere past Hollow Creek, out by the old lumber mill. Past that, there's nothing but junkyards and runoff tunnels." "Show me." The man sighed, then reached for a map. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He packed lightly flashlight gloves, crowbar bolt cutters, a small crowbar tucked into his coat. Not a gun. He didn't trust his hands to stay steady anymore. He drove out just after sunset. The road to Hollow Creek was rough, half gravel, half regret. Pines leaned too close, snow crunching under tires. The air felt colder there, tighter, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. At the edge of the old mill, he cut the headlights and parked. Silence. Then movement. Faint. A low hum buried in the wind. Jack followed it, through rotting siding and rusted sheet metal. Behind the old water tower, he found a dirt path, fresh tire marks carved into frozen mud. At the end, a bunker door set into the ground. Almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Jack crouched, listened. Voices, muffled, male, laughter, a bark, no several, high-pitched, agitated. He eased the crowbar from his coat. The door had a padlock, heavy. 2 sharp strikes, then silence. Jack opened it slow. A tunnel stretched downward, concrete and flickering overhead bulbs. The walls dripped moisture. The air smelled of urine, bleach blood, and wet fur. He crept in. Every footstep echoed too loud, but no turning back. Deeper. Now the sounds were clearer. Snarls, chains, a cheer. Jack's stomach turned. He passed a room lined with cages. Dogs, not all of them were moving. At the far end, voices cheered louder. A makeshift arena ringed with plywood and cheap lights. Men circled it, cash in fists, shouting. A dog lunged in the center, foam at its mouth, chained until released. Then he saw him, not in the ring, not yet. In the corner behind a heavy iron grate, Shadow sat. Shoulders bloodied, a fresh cut under his eye. But his posture, still proud, still silent, still Shadow. Jack's breath caught. He moved to the cage. Shadow looked up, their eyes locked, and Jack saw it, that flicker of trust, pain, recognition. Jack pressed a hand against the bars. "It's me," he whispered. Shadow didn't move, but his tail thumped once. Jack dropped to a knee, checked the lock. Thick chain rusted old. He reached for the bolt cutters. A hand grabbed his collar. Jack spun, elbow crashing into a man's face. Shouting erupted. He didn't wait. He jammed the bolt cutter into the chain's snap. The gate flew open. Shadow lunged forward, not to attack, but to stand beside him, guarding. "Go!" Jack hissed. "Run!" Shadow turned toward the arena tunnel. The men saw them. Shouts turned to screams. Someone drew a gun. Jack ducked behind a cage, yanked Shadow with him. Bang! A bullet tore into the concrete behind them. He scrambled, leading Shadow into a side corridor. The tunnel twisted dark, full of shadows. Shouts echoed. Footsteps gave chase. Another shot rang out. "Find him!" someone bellowed. Jack pulled Shadow into a drainage grate, metal grinding under his hands. Water flowed knee-deep, icy and foul. Come on, come on!" Shadow didn't hesitate. He followed shoulder to shoulder. They crawled blind, wet breath tight. Behind them, boots. Jack turned flashlight between his teeth. A glint just ahead, another grate. He rammed it with his shoulder. It gave. They spilled out into open air back behind the mill. Jack gasped. Shadow stood beside him, heaving. A truck engine roared to life behind them. They were still being hunted. Jack bolted for the woods, slipping, dragging Shadow by the collar. Trees blurred past. Headlights slashed through trunks. Snow exploded at his heels. Then the cliff. A sharp drop. Frozen creek below. No time. He looked at Shadow. "You trust me?" Shadow met his gaze. Then they jumped. Cold. Shock. Silence. Then breath. Jack surfaced first, gasping. Shadow swam beside him, cutting through the current. They reached the far bank, crawling through ice and roots. The headlights didn't follow. Just voices faint, frustrated. They were safe. For now. Jack collapsed against a tree, lungs burning. Shadow lay beside him, trembling, but alive. Jack reached over, ran a hand through damp fur. "You stayed," he whispered. Shadow pressed his head into Jack's chest. And Jack, who had lost too many things, too many times, held on. They made it out of the woods before dawn. Jack's truck was still there, parked off the highway, where he'd left it 2 nights ago in desperation. He half expected it to be gone, stripped or found by whoever ran that underground pit. But it was untouched. He wrapped Shadow in a thick tarp from the truck bed, lifted him gently onto the back seat, and slammed the door shut behind them. Both of them were bleeding, shaking cold to the marrow. But Shadow was alive. Still looking at Jack like he always had, steady, quiet, unbroken. They didn't go home. Jack didn't have a home anymore. He turned onto Route 19 and drove south. The only place that came to mind was a tiny animal rescue nestled at the edge of Pine Ridge Forest. It wasn't much, an old converted ranger station run by a woman named Dana, who owed Jack her life from a fire years ago. He hadn't seen her in nearly a decade, but she didn't ask questions when he pulled into her lot at 5:43 a.m. with a battered dog in the back seat and blood on his shirt. She just opened the gate and said, "Bring him in." The main shelter building was warm, sterile, and full of the soft sounds of early rising animals. Dana led Jack into a quiet exam room, flipped on a heat lamp, and helped him lay Shadow down on a blanket. Then she took one long look at him. "I've seen trauma. I've seen neglect. But this," she whispered, running a hand down Shadow's spine. "This dog's lived 100 lives." Jack didn't speak, just watched her work. Dana was quick and calm. Her fingers moved with certainty, checking vitals, cleaning wounds, stitching one jagged gash near Shadow's shoulder. Shadow flinched only once, never growled. "He trusts you," she said. "I didn't earn it," Jack replied. She met his eyes. "Maybe you did." After half an hour, she reached for the chip scanner. It beeped softly when she ran it down Shadow's neck. "Bingo," she muttered. Jack sat up. "He's chipped." Dana nodded, frowning. "Yeah, but something's off." She pulled the scanner back. "The ID number shows up. But when I plug it into the system, it's blank. No name, no address, no registry. Like it was erased. More like shut off. The chip exists, but someone buried its origin." Jack leaned forward. "Can you trace it anyway?" Dana hesitated. "Not from here. But I have a friend works with a rescue network out of state. She's dug into military records before. Private adoptions, illegal transfers. She might find something." "Do it." Dana picked up her phone and left the room. Jack looked at Shadow, breathing slow now, chest rising and falling under the soft red glow of the lamp. "I got you out," he whispered. "But I don't think we're even halfway done." 3 hours later, a volunteer named Micah walked in with a folder in his hands. He looked about 25, thin as a rail, but sharp. He dropped the folder on the table like it was radioactive. "I ran every chip fragment we could decode, cross-referenced with known aliases. And you're not going to believe this." Jack opened the folder. 4 different intake forms, 4 different shelters, 4 different states, 4 different names: Bear, Reaper, Onyx, Milo. Each one came with a photo. Same dog, different scars, different dates. Different people claiming to be the owner. "Who the hell is this dog?" Jack murmured. Micah sat down, breath tight. "Best guess, he was passed between people like property. Maybe stolen, maybe bought, maybe sold. But one thing's clear, someone's been covering his tracks. Jack flipped through the papers. Each photo showed Shadow older, and some younger in others, but unmistakably the same. The eyes were always the same. Then one photo made Jack freeze, not because of Shadow, but because of the man holding his leash. A face Jack recognized from the underground arena, the one who'd chased them through the woods. Jack's hands trembled. "He's connected," he said. "That bastard didn't just steal him. He's had him before." Micah looked over his shoulder. "If that's true, this whole thing's bigger than some backwoods dogfighting ring." "It is," Jack said. "And I want names." Dana returned, phone still in hand. "My friend's digging. She's found a few handlers connected to the XR16 designation. Says at least 2 of them disappeared from the system around the same time this dog did. She thinks he was rerouted," Jack said. Dana nodded. "Sold. Quietly. Probably passed through rescue orgs as cover." Jack looked down at Shadow again. "How many lives have you lived?" he whispered. The dog didn't stir. But even asleep, there was tension in his body. Like he was still listening, still waiting. That night, Jack stood alone under the porch light. He stared out into the dark tree line, the quiet broken only by the rustle of animals and the distant hum of a generator. Shadow was asleep inside, safe, finally. But Jack couldn't shake the question now burning in his chest like fire. Who let this happen? Not just once, not twice, over and over again. Shadow hadn't just been lost. He'd been discarded, used, recycled, and yet he still trusted, still saved, still stayed. Jack's voice caught in his throat. No man would survive that. But somehow this dog had. And Jack, he wasn't going to stop until someone answered for it. It started with a photo. Jack wasn't a man of social media. He didn't tweet, didn't vlog. But that night, after everything, after the rescue, after the revelations, he sat down on Dana's porch with Shadow asleep at his feet and uploaded a single image to the old Facebook account he hadn't touched in years. The photo was simple, Jack's hand resting on Shadow's head. The light of the porch lamp framing them in gold. He's been called Bear Reaper Onyx Milo. But to me, he's Shadow. This dog has saved more lives than most people I know. He's not just a survivor. He's the reason I'm still here. If you know him, if you've loved him, this is your chance to speak. We're listening now. He hit post and went inside. By morning, the story had been shared 200 times. By noon, 23,000. Rescue groups began tagging each other. Comments flooded in, some with sympathy, some with stories. Then something different. "I think this is the same dog who went missing in Boulder, Colorado 5 years ago. My brother worked at a therapy center. This dog used to help kids with PTSD. We called him Jasper. He used to ride the bus with my daughter. She cried for weeks when he disappeared." "Wait, is this the dog from Louisiana?" "We had a therapy animal who looked exactly like him. Gone after a break-in. The shelter filed a police report. Each message carried the same note beneath the surface. We thought he was gone forever." Jack sat in silence, phone in hand, reading every word. He didn't reply to most, didn't know how, but he saved every single one. Then came the video. It was a short clip sent by a woman named Natalie from Oklahoma. She appeared on screen first holding a laptop, then turned the camera toward a little girl sitting cross-legged on a colorful rug, maybe 7 years old. Dark curls, big eyes, a brace on one leg. The girl pointed at a photo on the screen of Shadow. She reached out, touched the screen with her fingers. Then she said in a soft, halting whisper, "Shadow." Natalie's voice broke off screen. That's the first time she said a word since the accident. He was her therapy dog. We called him Toby. He used to sleep by her wheelchair. Jack watched it twice. Then again, Shadow lay beside him, still dozing. Jack placed the phone down gently. His chest was too tight to speak. The next morning, a rescue group from Montana called. Their director had tracked Shadow's microchip to a batch of 14 dogs that had been rerouted after a fraudulent adoption agency shut down in 2019. No charges were filed. The dogs vanished into the system. Jack wrote everything down. Shadow had been through at least 5 states, possibly more. He had worn 5 names, served in silence, vanished without warning. But now the world knew. A news outlet picked up the story within 48 hours. Then another. Then a national morning show. The headline read, "The Dog Who Walked Through Fire, The Unbelievable True Story of Shadow." They interviewed Jack on a Zoom call. He didn't speak much, just told the story straight. The fire, the rescue, the underground ring, the names. He's been saving people his whole life, Jack said. But nobody stopped to ask who was saving him, the interviewer cried. So did most of the internet. Donations started flooding into Dana's shelter. Volunteers, medical supplies. People offered to adopt other dogs, to foster, to fund. But no one asked to adopt Shadow. They knew now he belonged where he was. In 1 week, Shadow had gone from stray to symbol, a living testament to what survival looks like when wrapped in fur and loyalty. That night, Jack took Shadow on a walk down the quiet trail behind the shelter. The air was cold again, but the stars were out sharp and defiant in the sky. Jack didn't speak, but as they walked, he glanced down. Shadow was walking just slightly ahead now, not following, leading. When they reached the ridge, Jack sat on a log gazing over the trees. Shadow sat beside him. For the first time, Jack said, "You don't belong to me. You belong to all of them. To every hand that touched you and still remembers." Shadow leaned gently into his shoulder. Jack swallowed hard. "But if it's all right with you," he added, voice soft, "I'd still like to be the one you come home to." The wind whispered through the pines, and Shadow stayed. That was answer enough. It began not with a blueprint, but with a fence. Jack built it himself, post by post, hands splintered and aching. Snow still lined the edge of the property, but the thaw had begun the earth soft enough to dig the sun hanging longer in the sky. He marked the boundaries of the land behind Dana's shelter. It had once been an abandoned training ground for ranger dogs, overgrown, forgotten. But Jack saw something else in it. He saw peace. He saw potential. He saw home not just for Shadow, but for all the others who had been used, discarded, broken. He called it Hollow Haven. The name came to him while staring at the fire one night. A place that had once been hollow empty, echoing with loss, but now a haven for those learning to breathe again. Dana helped spread the word. Within weeks, the first rescues arrived. A yellow lab named Finch, who flinched every time a door closed. A mutt named Lila, covered in cigarette burns, who didn't eat unless someone sat beside her. A massive mastiff with no name found, chained to a pipe in the basement of a foreclosed house, half his weight, all his spirit. Jack didn't force them. He waited. And Shadow was the one who moved first. He approached the new dogs slowly, calmly. Never barking, never dominating, just present. Sometimes he'd lie nearby. Sometimes he'd nudge a bowl closer. Sometimes he'd do nothing at all, just exist, breathing softly near them, until their bodies stopped trembling. It was like he knew, like he remembered. Jack watched in quiet awe. Shadow wasn't just recovering, he was leading. Word got out faster than expected. A local journalist named Rosa featured Hollow Haven in a human interest piece, where dogs heal dogs. She called it a place where survival meets compassion and dubbed Shadow the Silent Shepherd. The article went viral. By the end of the week, Hollow Haven received 117 emails, most from shelters begging Jack to take more dogs, most too traumatized for traditional adoption. Jack didn't say yes to all of them, but he said yes to many. And the dogs came, broken, bloody, terrified. But Hollow Haven had room. It didn't look like much a field, a fence, a small barn converted into a heated sleep space. But it was enough. Enough to be safe. Enough to feel the sky. Enough to relearn trust. The first letter came in the mail 3 days later, addressed to Shadow Echo Hollow Haven. Crayon on a yellow envelope. Jack opened it on the porch, while Shadow lay with his head in Jack's lap. Inside was a drawing, a stick figure of a little girl in a wheelchair with a black dog beside her. "Dear Shadow, I miss you. Mommy says I will come visit. I'm not scared to talk anymore. You're still my best friend. Love, Madison." Jack didn't cry often, but he did that day. And Shadow, eyes closed, thumped his tail once against Jack's boot, like he understood every word. By spring, Hollow Haven had 9 dogs in residence. Jack built a second fence, then a third. Volunteers came on weekends. Someone donated a horse trailer, which Jack converted into a mobile supply unit. Shadow remained the anchor of it all. He didn't run the place. He held it. On hard days, when one of the dogs regressed or howled for hours without end, Jack would catch Shadow quietly walking the fence line, checking on them, circling back. It was as if he needed to know they were all still there. Still safe, still fighting. And then something unexpected. Children. The rescue center began offering reading sessions where kids would come in and read aloud to the dogs. At first, Jack resisted. "They've been through too much," he said. "Noise stresses them." Dana replied, "So have those kids." He agreed, slowly. And what happened next surprised him. The dogs calmed. Something about the rhythm of the voices, gentle, unsure, full of innocence, cut through the dogs' defenses. Their ears perked up. Some approached. Some lay down at the children's feet. Shadow was the first to sit still for an entire book. Charlotte's Web, read by a boy named Milo, who hadn't spoken to his classmates in 2 years. Milo brought a drawing the next week. Shadow wore a superhero cape. The next day, another package arrived. Then another. Then a box. Letters from across the country. "Dear Shadow, you helped my big brother feel brave again. You look like my dog who passed away. I hope you're happy. I wish I could visit Hollow Haven. You're my hero." Jack kept them all. He bought a cork board and pinned them in the barn. It became a wall, then a second wall. Then the nameplates came in. Little brass tags with the names of the dogs who had come through and healed enough to be adopted or transferred. Each one told a story. Each one began the same way, lost, but didn't end that way. One night, Jack sat by the barn as the sun bled out over the horizon. Shadow lay beside him, chin on his paws. 9 dogs slept around them. Some snored, some whimpered in dreams. But all of them were whole in ways they hadn't been weeks ago. Jack took a deep breath. "I don't think I saved you," he said softly. "I think you saved me. And now you're saving them." Shadow opened one eye, blinked, then closed it again. That was enough. It began with a silence too thick for comfort. The dogs stopped barking all at once, something Jack had never heard in all the months at Hollow Haven. Not even the usual stirrings of Lila's pacing or the rustle of Finch's nervous tail. Just quiet, dense and unnatural. Jack was in the barn checking food bins when the silence reached him. He froze. Then Shadow growled, not loud, but deep, from the chest. That rare primal sound Jack hadn't heard since the woods. The kind of sound that didn't ask questions. It warned. Jack stepped outside. A black SUV was parked just beyond the outer fence. 3 men, 2 standing, one leaning against the hood with a slow, smug posture. Jack didn't need introductions. They weren't here by accident. The leaning man stepped forward, voice casual but sharp at the edges. "Evening, Mr. Whitmore. Heard you've been collecting what doesn't belong to you." Jack didn't move. "You're trespassing." The man smiled. "We're here for one thing only." The dog. Behind him, the others shifted slightly. One opened his coat just enough for Jack to glimpse metal gun or blade. Didn't matter. "Shadow's not yours," Jack said evenly. "Oh, but see, that's where you're wrong." The man stepped closer, tapping his chest. "We bought him 5 years ago, trained him, lost him, and now we're here to take back what's ours." Jack heard movement behind him. Dana, Micah, 2 of the volunteers stepping out from the barn and tool shed. Shadow walked forward. No leash, no hesitation. He stopped at Jack's side. Not barking, not snarling, just staring with that unblinking look that once held the weight of every scar he'd ever carried. "He's not property," Jack said. "Everything's property given the right price." The tension cracked. The man reached for his coat. Jack tackled him first. The others surged forward. Micah threw the feed bucket. Dana screamed for the police. The yard exploded into motion. The dogs barked again, an uproar, a chorus of chaos. One of the intruders lunged toward Shadow. Wrong move. Shadow didn't hesitate. He dodged left, circled behind, and bit low hard just below the man's calf. The scream was sharp, panicked. Jack wrestled the leader to the ground, fists swinging. He hadn't fought like this in years, but it came back, like breathing. Firehouse brawls, rescue riots, grief turned into grit. He pinned the man dirt in his teeth. "You want him," Jack growled. "You come through me." Sirens screamed down the valley before any of them could run. Red and blue lights cut through the trees. In less than 2 minutes, it was over. 2 men in cuffs, the third limping Shadow still standing between him and Jack. The police took statements. They took footage from the security cams, and then they asked the question Jack had hoped for. "Do you know where the ring operates from?" Jack didn't answer. Shadow did. He stepped toward the nearest officer, then stopped. Looked back. Waited. Jack nodded. "Follow him." What followed was one of the strangest operations the local force had ever seen. A former firefighter and a black dog leading 2 cruisers through winding forestry roads and back trails until they reached an old utility building half sunk into the ground. They kicked the door down. Inside cages. Dozens of them. Some full, some empty, some too late. But 23 dogs were still alive. Some barked in fear. Others cowered. But all were freed that day. One by one, they were carried out into the light. Shadow stood by the exit, watching them go. Silent. Present. Steady. Jack leaned against the doorway, eyes burning. "You brought us here," an officer said. Jack shook his head. He did. The story made national headlines again. Only this time it wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. Shadow was credited as the lead in the investigation. Photos showed him standing beside the police chief, calm and proud. Reporters asked for interviews. Animal rights organizations sent letters. Then came the call from the National Animal Protection Council. They wanted to honor him. Formally, the ceremony was quiet. Held on the same field where Hollow Haven began. A small podium, folded chairs, rows of faces, kids, veterans, rescue workers, and dozens of dogs who had passed through the Haven's gates. The head of the council stepped forward, badge gleaming. He knelt in front of Shadow, held out a medal engraved with a single word, Guardian. He placed it gently on the dog's collar. Shadow didn't move, but when he looked back at Jack, eyes full, body still, it was clear what this moment meant. He wasn't a number. He wasn't a tool. He wasn't a ghost passed from owner to owner. He was Shadow, and the world finally knew his name. The morning came slowly, like it always did in Hollow Haven. The frost clung to the grass a little longer now. The wind pressed softly against the side of the barn, whispering through the boards with a gentler voice than before. The sun didn't rush to rise. It stretched slowly over the edge of the ridge, like a memory returning. Shadow lay on the porch. Same spot, same posture, head resting on paws, eyes half-lidded, watching the line where the field met the forest. He didn't chase anymore, didn't patrol. But every dog that ran wild through the yard always paused on the steps, if only for a second. To check in, to acknowledge him. He was still the heart of the place, even if his muzzle was more silver now than black. Even if he no longer led, he remained the gravity, holding everything together. Jack sat just inside the door with a cup of coffee, one hand resting on an old journal. He glanced up at Shadow. "You're still watching," he whispered. Shadow didn't move. Didn't have to. That was his way. Later that day, a van pulled up the main road. Dana stepped out from the passenger side and walked around to open the sliding door. A little girl emerged, small frame, wide eyes, hands clenched tightly into her sweater sleeves. Her name was Elsie, 8 years old. Couldn't speak. Not because she didn't have vocal cords, but because trauma had locked her voice somewhere deep inside. Her parents had tried everything: doctors, therapists, medications. Now they were trying something else. Shadow remained on the porch as Elsie approached, one small hand held in Dana's. Jack stood at a distance, arms crossed over his chest, watching. Shadow didn't rise, just lifted his head slightly. Elsie stopped, her body tensed. One foot pulled back. Fear flickered in her eyes. Then Shadow blinked. Not once, twice. Slow, deliberate. Elsie's shoulders loosened. She took a step forward, then another. She didn't reach for him. She just sat down, right there on the porch beside him. Shadow turned his head, slowly, leaned in, rested his muzzle gently on her tiny knee. Elsie looked down at him. Her hand moved trembling toward his fur. She touched him, a feather-like graze at first, then with more pressure. Then her fingers curled, her mouth opened. No words, but she laughed. Not loudly, not boldly, just the faintest breathy, trembling laugh. Dana gasped. Jack turned away, blinking hard. Elsie lay down beside Shadow, curling into his side like she'd known him forever. That afternoon she didn't speak, but she stayed. The whole day. And that night, when her parents came to pick her up, they found her asleep in the hay, with Shadow curled protectively around her. No words, but something had shifted. That evening, Jack sat on the hill, overlooking the fields. The sky blazed orange and lavender, burning behind the pines. Below him, the dogs ran wild, chasing one another, rolling in the last patch of mud, barking in chaotic joy. He didn't need to call names anymore. They knew where to return when it was time. Shadow stayed by the porch. He didn't need to run anymore. But when Jack looked down and saw Elsie's drawing pinned beside all the others in the barn, he knew what it meant. It showed a house, a son, a girl, and beside her not a shadow, but a light. Jack opened his journal and began to write. You were never just a dog. You were a mirror, a memory, a protector, a beginning. No one knows what you endured. Not fully, not even me. But I do know this: you chose to stay. When you could have run, when you could have disappeared, you stayed. And that is what love really means. Not words, not promises, just the choice to stay, again and again, even after everything. Jack closed the journal. He looked out over Hollow Haven, the fields full of life, the porch holding its silent guardian. The world for once felt right. Shadow opened one eye, then closed it again. Still here, still home. The sign went up on a gray morning. Not cold, not warm, just quiet. Jack hammered the final nail into the wooden post outside Hollow Haven's main gate. Then stepped back slowly, hands resting on his hips, eyes fixed on the words carved into the grain. For the ones who were once forgotten. The letters were uneven, carved by hand, but each stroke had weight. Each word held history. The gate creaked open behind him. Shadow walked out onto the gravel, slow and steady, like he'd done every day for the past few years. His steps were softer now. The arthritis in his hips had made it harder to rise in the mornings. His breathing was slower, but his eyes, the soul of him, still burned with that steady light. Dimmer, perhaps, but not gone. Jack looked down at him. You approve? He asked softly. Shadow didn't wag his tail. Didn't need to. He sat beside Jack and looked up at the sign. They stood there a long time, just the two of them, the beginning and the end. That night the sky was unusually still. No wind, no rain. The stars spilled across the heavens like a trail of quiet, glimmering breadcrumbs. Jack lit a single candle in the new cabin, a small structure built near the barn. Shadow had stopped climbing the steps to the main house months ago, so Jack built something simpler, closer, warmer. A single room, a bed on the floor, a chair, a fireplace. Shadow lay beside the bed, his breathing shallow but steady. Jack sat on the floor next to him, one hand resting gently on Shadow's back, feeling the rise and fall, the warmth still pulsing beneath the fur. No machines, no vets, no fear. Just quiet, just love. Shadow looked up, once eyes searching Jack's face. Jack smiled. It's okay, he whispered. You can rest now. Shadow blinked slowly, then closed his eyes again. And sometime before dawn, with no sound at all, he slipped away. Still touching Jack's hand, still facing the door like he always did. Still home. The funeral wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. A simple service. Staff, volunteers, a few children who insisted on reading poems they wrote themselves. Dana brought flowers. Micah carved a small stone. Jack didn't speak, but he listened. To every voice, to every laugh, to every tear. And when the sun dipped below the trees, he stood alone over the grave behind the barn, just beneath the oak tree where Shadow had first curled up after the fire. The marker read, Shadow. You were the quiet that saved us. You stayed. And we will never forget. Weeks passed, then a month. The world kept moving. But Hollow Haven held a stillness now. Not sadness, just reverence. As if the land remembered. As if the barn breathed differently. Dogs still came. Children still laughed. But the space on the porch remained empty, untouched. Jack spent his days walking the perimeter, fixing the fence, organizing the new files. They had more rescues now than ever. More applications, more letters from around the world. But there was a space in him that stayed quiet. A silence that only one creature had ever filled. Until a car pulled into the lot. An old van rushed around the door, mismatched tires. A woman stepped out, holding the hand of a little girl, no older than 6. They walked to the back of the van, opened it gently, and lifted out a dog. Thin, shaking, one eye clouded. The girl held the leash tightly but didn't pull. She knelt down in the gravel level with the dog's gaze. I know you're scared, she whispered. But we're safe here. Jack watched from the doorway. He saw the dog lean forward slightly. Not with trust, but with hope. That was enough. He stepped forward. Got a name, he asked gently. The little girl turned to him, voice soft, clear. Hope. Jack felt something inside him shift. Not break. Open. He knelt beside her. Hope's a good name. She nodded. I picked it. Hope the dog pressed her nose gently into the girl's palm, then looked up at Jack. Something in those eyes, uncertain, wary, but waiting. Willing? Jack smiled. Welcome home. That evening, Jack sat by the fireplace again. A different dog lay beside him now. Not a replacement, not a copy, just the next story beginning. He reached for his journal, opened to the last page, and wrote, You are gone. But you are everywhere. In the field, in the porch steps, in the fear that turns to trust, in the quiet that leads to laughter, in the girl who named her dog Hope. You were never mine. You were never anyone's. You were the bridge, the light that rose from shadow. And when love is strong enough, even the darkest place can become the beginning of light. He set the pen down. Hope stirred beside him. Outside, the stars blinked alive again. And somewhere beneath the wind, beneath the bark of a pup settling in his crate, Jack could still feel it. A presence, a weight, not heavy, just there, still guarding, still staying, always.